Hi, I'm Rupa Roos, and you're listening to Context. Context is your guide to all things North Carolina politic, where we look at how things are happening in North Carolina, why they're happening in North Carolina, and what you can do to better participate in your representative democracy. Context is sponsored by Reboot NC, a nonpartisan initiative in North Carolina seeking to improve voter participation in the representative democracy. If you'd like to find out more about Reboot NC's platforms, where they focus on progress-oriented solutions to areas of agriculture, the economy, community values, and the environment, check them out. They're on all the social media platforms. Hashtag RebootNC, because together is so much better. In this, our inaugural episode, we're going to focus on what we are calling In the Beginning. And we're going to get started by getting to the crux of a few issues, exploring them and their intersections. Ethics and community, agriculture and community, the me versus the you versus the us, and what that means so we can build upon it. We're also going to briefly touch on federal versus state distinction because in the beginning, it was the federal, and it was the state. And the rights between the two are very distinct, and it's quite difficult to understand the hows and whys of North Carolinian government if you don't understand the separation of federal versus state rights. So with that, in the beginning, there was a revolution. Fast forward a few years, and a decision was made that states' rights mattered and citizens' rights mattered. But the citizens of Virginia were not interested in being guided by the same rules as Delaware, so they made a deal. They did so in order to combine their forces to protect them against the might of the evil invaders from Britain. And so an umbrella government was launched that unified these separate states but maintained their individual rights to control what happened within their boundaries. And that is why we have the separation of federal and state laws. Now, wouldn't it be great if it were just that simple? The truth is, for the last few hundred years, there has been consistent back and forth with both the federal and state governments trying to establish and maintain their specific rights. There are many, many case precedents that explore the interpretations of what areas belong to state and what belong to federals. Now, we do know the Constitution protects the citizenry of the United States in a number of critical areas. We also know the Constitution maintains the right of each state to use, protect, and serve their citizenry as that state's government, and in North Carolina, that's the governor and the General Assembly, sees fit. So long as the state's government is not violating the United States Constitution, then the state government can come up with whatever rules and form of government it wants to regarding regulations for a state. It's why fracking is constitutionally a states' right issue. It's also why health care, although the government, federal government, can offer an umbrella program, a state can opt out of it, as North Carolina's governor has. It's a subtle distinction, the separation between federal and states' rights, but the impact is huge. It's critical for citizens of a specific state's government to participate, because if one is not participating, and the way we do that is by voting, or for running for office or your local council, then the representative democracy can easily become an oligarchy, where only the interests with the deepest pockets, the most entrenched biases with the loudest voices, or those who simply consistently show up to vote have control over what is happening in the state government. Small d democracy, the truth is, if you don't use it by voting, you lose it. And that is definitely true here in North Carolina. When we think about the type of government we have, the concern is what rules exist and why should they exist? To get to the root and the crux of that question, we need to pull back away from the action of the rule into the territory of philosophy and to discuss the difference between morality and community and ethics, and the idea of how ethics and morality work in community. Community interests are a critical part of ethical analysis. Its importance is rooted in a subsect of ethics called ethics of value, which occurs when acts or behaviors are encouraged based on the attainment of a value outside the self, as in an act in community. versus virtue ethics, which is the pursuit of excellence in oneself, regardless of whether something outside of the self has value. Or versus duty ethics, which is based on what you should or ought to do, but is not what is in your nature to do. The final subsect is called ontological ethics, but we'll just keep it simple and call it acceptance. It's the idea of being concerned with authentic existence. The concept that death, birth, or suffering is the same. So why be emotionally challenged if one of those three things happen? If a young child dies, there is no reason for sadness. Now that is a very difficult ethos for the modern humankind to sit with and to accept. In the 1800s, there lived a German philosopher named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, Hegel purported that ethics were an actual practice. They're beliefs, rituals, and laws or customs of a community, and that a community uses them to achieve its goals or to achieve its purpose as a community. Morality, on the other hand, is the inner life of an individual. It's their attitude, their motivations, intentions, the private language one has with oneself that maintains the inner standards you carry as you go through life and interact with community. Now, Hegel believed the community provided the concrete form in which an individual can exercise and cultivate their morality, that community was a necessary structure for humans to have. Without it, Hegel believed a person could not fully actualize their inner freedom. This is akin to the Hindu tradition and their belief in Dharma. For both Hegel and Hindu Dharma, the actions inspired by community brought about the greatest being of a human. They are guidelines that help the person coexist with others in community while achieving their individual best. This is in line with Western philosophy that is focused on how to be or what one ought to do. Western philosophers and the philosophies tend to support the individual innately having the moral and practical understanding within themselves already, and that your source of greatness is already cultivated through wisdom that is inside of you. Now, this is converse to Eastern philosophies such as Taoism or Confucianism, which tend to support the idea of wisdom being passed down and moral life coming from having followed a sage and modeling until you yourself have achieved the mastery, rather than the Western principle of inner mastery that preexists. Eastern philosophy emphasizes a focus on practical, exemplary members of a community who can teach all others the way. It is these two succinct, different principles that challenge the way a community governs. It's true in North American politics and in North Carolina governance. The question is, how do we govern? Does the best government work when led by those who sat under the tutelage of others to gain the knowledge needed? Or the idea that individuals innately possess the wisdom and that all that is needed is a structure outside of us to tap into that potential, as Hegel believed? Or, as libertarians assert, you don't need structure. You just have the necessary wisdom from within, and you don't need government to help create that form for you. That question and those possibilities are what government is always grappling with. To what degree are rules needed, and in what areas of our lives do they need to be applied? One way to determine that is to look at the intersecting needs of a community. So we turn to intersections, where we explore how the issues affecting agriculture, community values, economics, and the environment interrelate in our state, preparing for the future while tending to the present. Regardless of personal beliefs, it's clear that early mankind relied upon nature to survive, and that we still do. It's rather evident that nature is the source of all we use and survive from, be it the berries we use in our smoothies, or oil harvested to burn in our trucks, or tree bark used to make medicine for our headaches. It's a no-brainer that we need to consider just how much nature, our access to it, and our cultivation of it benefit us, our families, our communities, and our industries. We can do this by seeing how our community and the values of ethics our cultures rely on impact agriculture. Scientists can trace, since early mankind, how the reliance on agriculture, the cultivation of plant and animals to serve a culture, has led to progress for humankind. In North Carolina, our unique geographical landmass offers a rich variety of resources, from the age of our mountains and the woodland plants that offer tasty and medicinal remedies, to the Piedmont with its rich silt and tillable land, to the coastal plain with its complex waterways and fishing potentials. Each region has developed communities reliant upon that specific region's agricultural industry. With that came unique community values. From mannerisms to priorities, North Carolina's population has a history of a variety of influences, priorities, and interests. It is a challenge for one state to attend to such a varied population. Considering all that variety that we have here, there is a constant. Regardless of where you are from, be it the mountains, the Piedmont, or the coastal plain, we have a commitment to North Carolina. This is a historical truth, one we can't lose sight of when hurricanes come through and decimate our coastal plains, or when the ice-layered mountain roads force school closings, or when industries are undermined. History shows that a state needs to be nimble and focused on the ties that bind and not the divides that conquer, to be a healthy steward of the unique communities that make up our state. As we move forward, the strength of North Carolina will be defined by what actions legislators take to make sure the coastal towns are rebuilt, the students of the mountains have other ways to be educated when there are school closings due to snow, that there are incentives for industry with long-term vision for the North Carolina community and its health. It's North Carolina ethics because it is what North Carolina values. So we're going to call this cause and effect story time. Once upon a time, there was a town in the Piedmont region of North Carolina that decided it wanted to tap into a highly prized market, one that had been valued for thousands of years. And they decided that thanks to their ample supply of mulberry trees, they were an ideal location to cultivate a very valuable product. So they spent a significant sum of money and sent away to China for many, many silkworms. They planted more of their native mulberry trees, and they looked forward to reaping the benefits of being the only United States-made provider of this very valuable product. Now, silkworms are the source of silk. They have been cultivated over the last 1,000 years to the point that they cannot fly and therefore are a captured species and can no longer be found in their natural state. So their existence consists of being born, feeding voraciously on a specific plant, building a cocoon, hatching, mating, laying eggs, and then dying. They live a very short, rather motionless life. Now, humans take the cocoons of these silkworms and they spin them into a fiber that then gets woven, and you get to experience the luxury of having a silk-made garment. Traditionally, the silkworm is killed during the harvest of the cocoon. Now, there is a variant of silk production called pea silk, in which the silkworm is purported to be allowed to emerge from the cocoon to live its full life cycle before it dies. Silkworms exclusively eat the leaves of the mulberry tree. And if you've ever had a fresh mulberry fruit, you can understand why a silkworm would exclusively choose to eat this plant. A mulberry fruit is fragrant, and its flavors are very unique and delicate. That said, silkworms only eat one variety of mulberries, and they do not eat any other leaf other than the leaf of the white mulberry tree. Now, unfortunately for this town in North Carolina, their trees and the trees they intentionally planted were not the white mulberry tree, rather a type of mulberry now named after this town. For whatever reasons, they invested a fortune in this entire operation, and after the silkworms arrived, they soon learned that their trees were the wrong kind of mulberry, and so their entire cash crop industry died, taking with it an immense amount of money. The moral of the story is, do your research. When a community or a government is going to enact a law or initiate a policy, make sure you understand the long-term effects. It's a truism for all governance. but responding to a challenge that one is seeing emerge in their society without fully researching the potential consequences and quickly making a decision can lead to a town never realizing its community goals or purpose, as was the case in Silk Hope, North Carolina. A beautiful, quaint town. I recommend you go for a visit, but you won't find any silkworms there. And that is context for this episode. Thank you for joining us in the beginning. We'll keep bringing you the intersections, the inspired minds, the change makers, the cause effects, and the pragmatic matters that help explain the full context of North Carolina governance and hopefully inspire you to get involved in our state's representative democracy. We would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the hefty contributions of a specific book on this episode. Edited by Beena Gupta, called Ethical Questions, East and West. This is a book you want in your library. Until next time, enjoy the vistas, the breezes, and the laughter your North Carolina life brings you. Oh, and don't forget to remember the context.